Okay, let's do some gearhead nerd stuff. And since we've been on the topic of rear differentials for the last couple of videos, let's stay on that just for one more. So I want to talk about choosing the right rear for your application. The best compromise between strength and efficiency. And I want to talk specifically about the Ford 9-inch rear because that's the that's the go-to rear for everything. And for good reason, and we're going to get to that. And right away, I can see it in the comments. People are like, he just hates Fords. No, not at all. I actually happen to be extremely fond of the 9-inch rear. At one point, I didn't have any Chrysler rear stuff. All I had was 9-inch Ford stuff. So I'm not dissing them in any way, shape, or form. Just explaining the differences and the characteristics and the evolution, because the evolution of it is pretty interesting. So choosing the right rear for your application. The best way to go about it is to just use this ring and pinion. Unfortunately, I don't have any 9-inch stuff here at all. All I've got is Chrysler parts. So we're going to have to use these things to illustrate the differences. So if efficiency was the only goal, just you want to have something that has the least amount of resistance, easiest breakaway, and least amount of operating resistance. The optimum placement for the pinion on the ring gear would be at the 3 o'clock position. So this is 12 o'clock, this is 6 o'clock, here's 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock would be the optimum position because that's where the pinion has the most advantageous angle to spin the ring gear. This would take the least amount of power. But it would also be relatively weak also because there would be the least amount of contact area between the pinion and the ring. And that's why helical cut gears are used, because a helical cut gives you the most contact patch, the most contact area. But this, in theory, in a perfect world, would be the perfect place to put the pinion in relation to the ring gear. Now, the vast majority of differentials that you come across have the pinion placed approximately at the 4 o'clock position. And that's pretty much where these Chryslers are. Approximately the 4 o'clock position. So this is the best compromise between lack of breakaway resistance and leverage against the ring gear. It's the best basic overall compromise. The 9-inch, on the other hand, the unique thing about the 9-inch, what makes this, there's a couple of things that make it strong, is that the pinion is placed at approximately the 5 o'clock position. Now when you get to the 6 o'clock, that's just pure worm gear. But at the 5 o'clock position, you still have the regular helical characteristic, the helical cut of the gears. You've got all of those qualities that you're looking for as far as that goes, as far as engagement goes. But you've got a position now where you've got the most amount of resistance and the most amount of breakaway, right? Or it takes the most amount of power to achieve breakaway. Breakaway is where you go from completely stationary to mobile. But that's what gives those two things that give the 9-inch its strength. But let's talk about how it got there, because that's pretty unique. Like, it's like where the gearhead nerd stuff comes in. So you have to go back to the 1950s, middle 1950s. And the 9-inch didn't evolve because Ford engineers were looking to build this bulletproof rear that would be used in the hot rods 60 years down the road, 70 years down the road. They were looking to satisfy the demands of the stylists. Okay, so middle 1950s, the space age, the jet age, all of the manufacturers, all of the stylists wanted the cars to be lower and sleeker and everything else. So where earlier cars, the body was just kind of like just plopped on top of the frame and you had all the room underneath you needed. When they started to lower the cars for the later 1950s, they started to run into drivetrain problems. Because obviously now, if you're going to lower the body of the car on the frame but keep the wheels in the same basic position, well, now you're bringing the drive shaft up into the car. That was one problem. The other problem had to do with interior stylists. So, the prestige cars of the day, and let's stick with Fords for a minute. the 9-inch evolved at about the same time as the Edsel. Now, the Edsel was supposed to be marketed as an upscale, top-of-the-line car, high trim, high everything. It was a prestige car. And the stylists, the interior stylists, did not want, they wanted as little a dry shaft tunnel as possible for the rear seat passengers. Now, here's why this was important. They wanted passengers to be able to get in the car from the passenger side, from the curb side of the car. So if you're parked on a street, let's just say, and you've got the driver's side is open to traffic going to and from, they wanted passengers to be able to get in the car effortlessly from the passenger side, back seat, and just scoot over and not have the hump in the way. I know, it seems trivial, but I guess if you're an interior stylist of the 1950s, this is paramount, okay? So they went out of their way to minimize the drive shaft tunnel. And this is what the Ford drivetrain engineers were presented with, because the drivetrain comes afterwards. The stylists get the first shot at it, and then the drivetrain has to make everything fit. So what Ford engineers did was they designed a rear with the lowest possible pinion height, what they considered to be the lowest possible pinion height. Now, other rears of the day were like that also, like the LaSalle Cadillac rear comes to mind, right? And that's a dropout center section also, but it has extremely low pinion. But they were weak, they were fragile rears. They were fragile because one of the problems, one of the side effects of dropping the pinion on the ring gear is that there's deflection involved now. When you put power to it, and I'm not talking about 1,000 horsepower, I'm talking about you put 300 horsepower, 400 horsepower to a very low pinion in, let's say, a 4,500 pound car. The pinion wants to walk away from the ring gear. Now, over time, this tears up the pinion bearing and it fatigues the teeth. So those rears become fragile and they take a lot of power to turn, but that's besides the point. What Ford did was, and this was like a stroke of genius, what Ford did was, engineers, what they did was they added a pinion support bearing to the front of the pinion gear. So now it was supported or I should say the back. So it was supported at the front with the traditional bearings, but then it also had another bearing here that kept it from deflecting. It held everything together. And that made the 9-inch Ford a really strong rear. It was originally designed, originally intended that way because of its use in those prestige cars. But it was a strong rear, it was a versatile rear, it was like the corporate strong rear, so it ended up in light trucks and all sorts of different applications. But it was that pinion bearing that they added, the pinion support bearing that they added, that made the difference. Stroke of genius, it was a stroke of genius. It also led to a little bit of a problem because now typically when you go to assemble a differential, you take the pinion gear and you slide it into the housing, right? And then you go from there. But the pinion support bearing now is here in the case. So how do you assemble this thing with the bearing in the way? Well, that's where the detachable front section of the 9-inch came from, where the front bearings are housed in a separate housing that's bolted to the main case. So that because that pinion bearing support is here, well, now you could just load everything in through the front. That is how the Ford 9-inch evolved to become the rear that it is. The benefit, the side benefit to that is that for a high performance standpoint, now you've got maximum engagement, you've got maximum engagement between the teeth of the pinion and the ring gear, and then you've got a way to keep the pinion from deflecting away. And that's how the 9-inch evolved to be the darling of the high performance industry. But it wasn't always like that. The 9-inch wasn't really a super desirable rear, generally speaking, until you got into, let's say, the middle to the late 1980s. In certain applications, like in fuel cars, it took over. 1975, 1976. The 8 3/4 was gone, the Dana 60 was gone, and racers are gone almost exclusively to the 9-inch rears. Now here's one of those weird benefits, one of those weird side effects. Because the 9-inch Ford with its low pinion placement, and forget about just strength, because the Dana 60 really is just as strong. But because of the lower pinion placement and the fact that it takes so much more power to break away, to go from stationary to moving, there was an added benefit with the fuel cars. Because at that time in the early 70s, early to middle 70s, they had started to experiment with overdrive pumps. And obviously, the nitro car, the more fuel you put into it, the more power it makes. But that fuel needs resistance to burn. Well, cars that use a 9-inch Ford, because it took that much more initial breakaway power, were more efficient on the hit. They burned more of the fuel on the hit, so therefore they made more power. So it was a situation where the added resistance of the rear actually helped the overall tune-up of the car, and they went faster. It's a lot of things with nitro is counterproductive, counterintuitive. But in other classes of racing, it wasn't really the rear of choice, because that benefit of the added strength wasn't worth the added resistance. So at some point, and I'm not sure the exact year, at some point in the 1980s, just to give you an example, the NHRA with superstock cars, originally superstock rules said that the car had to use a rear manufactured by the same company. So if you had a GM car, you had to use a GM rear. You had a Ford car, you had to use a Ford rear. Chrysler. Well, in some point in the middle 1980s, they did away with that rule, and it was like you could just use any rear in any car. So what became the rear end of choice for automatic superstock racers? The 12-bolt Chevy, the 12-bolt GM rear became the rear end of choice. A lot of superstock Hemi cars in the middle 1980s into the 1990s actually used 12-bolt rears. Why? Because the 12-bolt was a very strong rear, but it had a high or traditional 4 o'clock pinion placement. It was about the same strength as, let's say, the 8 3/4 Chrysler, but it was lighter overall, and it took less resistance to turn. So the 12-bolt was actually the darling of higher-end, like automatic superstock racers. Stick racers actually did prefer the Ford because it had that much more engagement. So that's how the rear end evolved to where it is. And today, it's the darling. It's the go-to in just about every type of performance use. But it's not the ultimate rear. It's the ultimate rear for certain applications. But there are compromises. And one of the things, if you're building a car for yourself and you're looking for maximum efficiency, because that's really what it all is. It's a combination of efficiency and strength. You want maximum efficiency and the maximum strength that goes along with it. So if you're doing a car, let's just say, and drag racing, drag strip performance is not part of the equation. It's just a cruiser. It's a muscle car type of thing. It's just something you want to roll down the road with. The 9-inch is the opposite of what you want. What you want is a rear end that has a higher pinion placement. The higher the pinion on the ring gear, the less resistance there is. If strength isn't a consideration, meaning that you're not hammering this thing, you're not going to put slicks to it and a trans brake and launch it. You're just going to drive this car. You want a rear end, you want to find a rear that has the highest possible pinion placement. That'll give you the best results as far as efficiency goes, because it takes the least amount of power to turn. The higher the power level, the lower you want to drop the pinion. So that's, in a nutshell, that's it. And I can't name specific rear ends because there's so many different variations, so many different options. But the 9-inch is not the way to go for that type of application. You're much better off with something like an 8 3/4 Chrysler or 8 1/4 Chrysler or an 8.8 Ford. The 8.8 has a more traditional 4 o'clock position pinion gear. And they did that, the 8.8 replaced the 9-inch when efficiency became a thing in the 1980s. That's why the 8.8 evolved. So one size does not fit all. As long as you know what your goals are, then that'll help you choose which rear end is going to do the best job for you. Now on the plus side of the 9-inch, even though it's been out of production for years now, decades now, there's no rear end that has more choice more parts, aftermarket parts and support available to it. You can get street gears, you can get pro gears, you can get any ratio you want, you can get any combination, any type of carrier that you want for the thing. There's aftermarket parts up the wazoo. If you're building something that's plus 600 horsepower in the 3,000 pound and heavier range, then a 9-inch rear really is the only choice these days. So, like I said, not hating on these things at all. I love them. They're fantastic. And I said, at one point in my life, I had no Chrysler rears. All I had was 9-inch Ford stuff. I could picture the nodular cases sitting on the shelf. But time goes on, things evolved, and now I'm back to this Mopar stuff. All right, I hope you got something out of that, and I'll see you tomorrow. No more differential stuff.